So hello, Oki, Abawadatek, Dada Nastanada, Tansi, and Bonjour. So welcome to this session where we'll be sharing the results of the up-and-coming roadmap for Canada's battery value chain. The report launches Wednesday, and so we're excited to give you all a sneak peek today of what's in the report. I'm Julie Roll. I'm the director of the Impact Studio and lead animator with the Energy Futures Lab. And today's webinar is brought to you through a collaboration between the Energy Futures Lab, the Battery Metals Association of Canada, the Transition Accelerator, and Accelerate Alliance. And we'll be hearing from someone from each of these organizations throughout today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize that we're all joining from traditional territories across this vast nation. I'm grateful to be joining from Treaty 7 territory, which has been stewarded by the people of the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley, the Tsuut'ina, and those who belong to the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Piikani, Kainai, and Siksika First Nations, and Métis Region 3. As we enter discussions about developing a battery value chain within Canada, we must recognize the harms of decolonization and be mindful of how we must change our relationships so that going forward, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike may walk in a good way and be stewards of the land in all it provides. Tomorrow is National Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize and celebrate the unique and diverse heritage and cultures of all Indigenous peoples. Okay, so today's agenda, next up, we'll have Eric Pelletier from the Battery Metals Association of Canada. He's going to give us a little bit of a background on this work. And then the majority of the time will be spent by Bentley Allen. He's going to do a deep dive of what's in the report and what the recommendations are. Matthew Fortier from Accelerate Alliance will do a little bit on some next steps and where we go from here. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So we've got today's session as kind of an open meeting versus webinar format. So feel free to type your questions into the chat, raise your hand at the end if you'd like, and we'll get your questions through, and then we'll close off. We've got this scheduled for about 60 minutes, so we will dive into it. So I'd like to turn it over now to Eric Pelletier.
Thanks, Julie. And thanks everyone for joining us today for this launch and preview summary of the battery value chain industry roadmap. As a preface to the summary that Bentley will be presenting momentarily, I wanted to share a brief introduction and background for BMAC and this collaborative work undertaken with our membership and partners. For those who may not be familiar, the Battery Metals Association of Canada is a national nonprofit association of industry participants and champions from across all segments of the battery metals value chain. Our members span mining, specialty chemical production, manufacturing, and end-use applications, as well as recycling. Together, our vision is to build a strong and enduring Canadian battery metals industry so that Canada can meet its domestic goals of energy transition, but also more broadly to help the world do the same. As the world races to decarbonize, battery energy storage continues to grow as a necessary technology critical to the success of our energy transition. I won't take too much away from Bentley's summary preview here, but suffice it to say that the demand implications for battery metals to achieve this are significant and present in and of themselves a momentous challenge. In challenge, however, lies opportunity. To achieve this vision of a robust and enduring battery metals industry, BMAC is focused on coordinating and connecting the segments of the value chain to build out the ecosystem and help accelerate their development in Canada. Ultimately, this work aims to ensure that Canada is well positioned to capture the economic potential at hand and on a timeline that will not see us fall behind. This report is the product of a collaborative engagement with our members and industry partners over a series of workshops conducted over the last 18 months. These sessions set out to understand firsthand challenges from industry, to set the vision and ambition calibrated to present day analogs, and to put forth concrete, actionable priorities to achieve this potential. From these sessions, several priority actions were identified, but first among them was the need for industry and government to come together on a national strategy for the battery metals value chain in Canada. To this end, BMAC, its members and partners, have produced a clean competitiveness roadmap for the battery metals industry in Canada. We're excited to share this collaborative work with you and the important feedback, perspectives, and key priority actions devised from this engagement. So with that, I'll now pass it over to Bentley, the lead author for this report, to provide the summary presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Eric, and thanks for Julie and my friends at the EFL, as well as my friends at the Accelerate Alliance, for all the work that has gone into this. It's really taken an entire village, and I also need to thank many of the people who are on the call who provided really critical input. This is absolutely not my work. This is the work of a collaboration for sure, and it was really my honor to hold the pen on it and to pull it all together. That said, I exempt everybody in the acknowledgements from responsibility for the arguments, but at the same time, they do absolutely reflect, I think a common judgment, a common set of judgments amongst all the partners and the individuals. So I'm delighted to present a little sneak preview of the roadmap for Canada's battery value chain. And the subtitle here is really important. We're trying to make a contribution to building a national strategy. We don't aggrandize ourselves the role of making that, but we're providing a contribution, an input, and a call to continue the work that we've begun here. So as Eric said, we really start from that big demand opportunity. Canada has an enormous opportunity. Canada has enormous potential, and everybody understands the need to seize on it. So what we wanted to do in this roadmap was really get practical right away. What has to be done today to build a Canadian battery metals industry that will be a significant contributor to Canada's long-term prosperity? This means making smart investments. This means building an innovation ecosystem, but it also means all the things that are in the media today, that we need to be building factories and that we need to be securing investments in the critical mineral supply chain. This report really makes four main interventions. In order to really have a clear understanding of what we're doing, we need some bold and clear targets for battery metals production. And the report takes a stab at providing those targets based on some modeling and some scenario analysis. The second intervention of the report is that Canada really has to systematically build homegrown capacity along the supply chain. A lot of the current politics of this stuff has really been dependent on attracting foreign direct investment from large OEMs and chemical producers, as well as miners that are internationally based. And that's great. It's great that we're attracting foreign investment in our supply chain. But as we'll see, there may be some problems with that. And really, we have an opportunity to address some of the structural problems that have plagued the Canadian economy for a really long time through the battery metal supply chain. The third intervention is that the midstream segment of chemical production is really crucial to building a supply chain that's going to be able to compete over the entire transition. And again, this is cutting against the public discussion, which tends to be focused both on the upstream mining and the downstream automotive and battery manufacturing, but is really not paying quite enough attention to that middle segment where those minerals are turned into battery active materials. And the report really emphasizes the importance of this midstream segment. And finally, the report kind of makes a process or a policy argument, which is that we can use roadmaps like the one that we've laid out here to catalyze investments, to produce investments that really are going to unlock the value and connect the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. We have all the elements of a supply chain here in Canada. We just need the right investments, the right timing, the right timetables to unlock them and tie them all together. So the report makes these four main claims, and I'm going to run through them all in a minute. But I just wanted to say, as Eric did, that the roadmap is really a product of this partnership. And when we came together as a group, it was because we know that no one group can do all this alone, and that the more voices and representation that we have, the better in all of this. So we really did partner, and it was a great time for the Transition Accelerator. We had been working on this methodology with our colleagues at Smart Prosperity Institute, specifically Derek Eaton, who heads up the Clean Growth work there at Smart Prosperity, to develop a methodology for clean competitive roadmaps that we could use in order to drive net zero industrial strategies. And that 6-step methodology, really the first 3 steps, BMAC had already done. So it was really wonderful timing. They had done that in conjunction with the Energy Futures Lab. And Accelerate was positioning itself as an organization that would convene the more downstream part of the supply chain, whereas BMAC had convened the upstream part of the supply chain. So it was really just a kismet, wonderful thing that these 4 organizations were able to come together and work so well together and really get to work on 4 and 5. And then Matt is going to tell us a little bit about step 6 later in the program, which we're just getting started on now. And we invite everybody who's on the call today to partner with us in advancing the key pieces of the roadmap. So let's start with some targets. The report really starts from a key premise, which is that we should try to basically keep Canada's position in the North American supply chain for automotive manufacturing. Right now, Canada produces about 10% of North America's vehicle share in what's really an integrated supply chain, right? The cars we produce in Canada, most of them get sold in the United States, and we import lots of cars from the United States. So we have an integrated North American vehicle market. We produce about 10% of it. So the report lays that down as a baseline. Let's keep that 10% market share, but let's not just have that 10% market share in the vehicle assembly. Let's have it in batteries, in chemical production, and in mining. And so we lay out targets across the entire value chain to capture this. The first really principle here is that we are going to need to produce 1.3 million vehicles by 2030, because that's what the government mandates currently would require. In order for us to produce 60% of light duty vehicles by 2030, which is the new target under the emissions reductions plan by the federal government, we need to produce 1.3 million cars in 8 years, 1.3 million electric vehicles in 8 years. Now, if you think we're going to produce that number of cars without a concerted, hard push on the upstream and the midstream, you're wrong. We're going to need a lot of effort in order to get that many electric vehicles off the supply chain, off the production line by 2030. And then we have to add another million in the following 10 years. That then gets broken down into certain numbers of gigawatt hours of batteries. We call this the battery fleet in the report. And we have made a strong bet, which is that lithium iron phosphate batteries are going to continue to grow in their application and their use. And that Canada, because both it has historic expertise in lithium ion batteries, should really try to position itself as a world leader in the production of these batteries. So we don't want to just produce nickel-rich batteries. We should also be trying to produce lithium-ion batteries. Sorry, my mouse is deciding that it's going to control the slides. I'll try to get it under control. So we need to produce 100 gigawatts of batteries, 50 LFP and 50 nickel-rich by 2030 to meet these targets. And we need to produce 100 gigawatts of each by 2040 in order to meet these targets. And then that can be broken down then in terms of how much of each of the individual minerals are we actually going to need. And the report does that. It gets really into this high level of granularity to try to make us understand, what do we actually need to do in nickel? What do we actually need to do in cobalt and lithium in order to make this happen? And it's at that level that we really need to be making strategy, not just at the big level and not just at the downstream level, but at the level of the minerals itself. So those are the bold, clear targets that motivate the action plan that's in the report. So then the report seeks to try to understand how we could actually build a strategy to deliver on these targets and how we're actually going to meet this, knowing that in the real world, we're not actually going to get 10% of each individual mineral, but sometimes we're going to have a little bit more than 10, sometimes we're going to have a lot less than 10, but we should be trying and aiming overall for a value chain that is 10% of the North American market. So how are we going to make that strategy? The first, as I said, is that we really need to try to focus on building homegrown capacity. The existing focus on foreign direct investment and downstream investment needs to be complemented by a strategy that will leverage homegrown capacity, leverage Canadian firms. Now, why is that really important? It's not just a nationalist argument. It's not just an argument that we should be doing it because we're Canadian. Part of this is geopolitics. What the war in Ukraine has really shown us is that dependency on Russia and China and other authoritarian countries for our critical mineral supply chain is a major liability. Europe is right now wrenching itself backward and forward to try to get out of gas. We're in an even worse situation than Europe is on gas with China on battery metals. So we absolutely need to have this homegrown capacity and we need to have these firms. But even if we were to draw on South Korean and European firms, as we've been doing a lot of here, there are still reasons why we would want to build homegrown versions of those firms and also American firms. And the reason is partly because of these structural problems that we have in the Canadian economy. You hear a lot about how we're really good at creating good startup firms, but they don't scale here in Canada. So we have this problem with delivering big national firms that get to scale, that would produce lots of jobs. and that critically would locate their research and development facilities here in Canada. Too often, Canadian industry is run by firms which locate their research and development facilities elsewhere. That means the innovation, the decision-making, the way the supply chain is constructed is being designed in other places with other countries' interests and geopolitical priorities determining that. So a strong national ecosystem really means that we have innovation capacities here in Canada that we can use to leverage our specific mineral resources and our specific needs in a global economy, as well as helping to build jobs, create jobs, create innovative industries that are going to compete long-term in what's going to be a really highly competitive global space. So there's kind of a deep structural economic reason why we want to be building homegrown capacity. So the question is, how do we do this? How are we going to learn from the foreign direct investments that we've been able to attract through ISED's really excellent leadership and turn that into a strong national ecosystem? The starting point for that, I would argue, is that we need a strong midstream, because it's the midstream that anchors what we call in the report an integrated supply chain. An integrated supply chain really takes into consideration Canada's specific medical endowment, that is Canadian geology, right? And the needs that we have on the battery side, as we've argued, that should be LFP heavy, LFP and nickel rich together, but LFP heavy. And then tries to build an economically and socially and politically and environmentally efficient and effective supply chain to connect those two things, right? If the decisions about Canada's supply chain are made by foreign OEMs, we're going to end up with supply chains that may or may not be efficient. So just to give you a quick example, Vale's facilities in Newfoundland produce nickel matte. Nickel matte is a great product if you're a global commodity trader, a global commodity mining firm that is trying to basically get value in a global market with highly uncertain and highly volatile price movements. It's not actually the decision you would make if you were trying to make an efficient battery supply chain. You wouldn't go to metal at the matte stage, which then has to be decomposed back into precursors in order to go into batteries. It's an inefficient way to design that flow sheet. And it's designed that way because it's designed with the profit margins of a global corporation at hand. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just that we might want to design the supply chain in a different way. So building midstream firms that can make those decisions here, that can help to create a supply chain that delivers on Canadian promise here in conjunction with national partners is kind of a way for us to build out that midstream and a way for us to really deliver on that homegrown capacity and to get an efficient, long-term competitive supply chain. The fourth intervention of the report is that we should use roadmaps to support catalytic investments. Catalytic investments are investments that try to unlock the potential that a country has. And this is in opposition to maybe more heavy-handed industrial policy tools, such as a local content requirement. A local content requirement would say, if you're going to produce cars in Canada, you need to use battery metals from Canadian feed, and you need to do that at 50% of the value chain or something like that has to be Canadian content. The problem with these is that they're increasingly challenged in international trade disputes. So the European Union just challenged the UK's offshore wind industrial strategy, which has a UK local content requirement in it. Now, this is kind of ironic because, of course, Europe is at the same time trying to reshore its own battery supply chain. So there's a geopolitical tension there. But what it means is that local content requirements might be unstable policy instruments for small economies that are vulnerable to the trade leverages that other countries can bring to bear. So what we need to do instead is design a strategy that doubles down on coordination and communication amongst the supply chain, rather than one that makes explicit rules about what's going to be required where. There are also protectionist reasons why we might not want to do that as a small open economy. We want to remain open to foreign investment. And the more protectionist things that we put in place, the more difficult it's going to be for global firms to operate in the way that they want to. And we do want those global firms to be part of our national ecosystem. And so this roadmap can be the foundation of a national industrial strategy that doesn't use the old policy tools of an industrial strategy that are problematic in some fundamental ways. So what does actually a roadmap look like? Well, the report presents kind of schematically work in these four streams: mining, chemicals, battery cells and packs, and recycling and reuse. And each of these has their own individual target. And each of these has their own individual key priority projects that come in at certain times. I'm not going to try to explain the image that's in front of you. I'll invite you to look at the report when it's released on Wednesday and try to decompose and spend more time with this image. Instead, I'll give you a flavor of what's in the report as an invitation for your own deeper dives into it. So each of those 4 areas, mining, chemical, batteries, and recycling, is then further decomposed into an overall goal. In this case, for mining, maximize lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite production. Those would be the 4 priorities that I would put on the table. And then it also gives a key action item, 4 or 5 or 6 action items underneath that goal. And then these 1.1 is then further decomposed into 1.1.1 and 1.1.1.1. So there's really concrete stuff in the report about how we can actually get the work that needs to be done started and where the priorities should be and could be within a Canadian roadmap strategy. Now, again, without going into all of the details here, I'll just lay out the 4 overarching goals. So the first is to maximize those 4 particular minerals, but of course we need to do more on all the other minerals as well, and the report has recommendations for all the minerals. The second is in chemistry to produce a world-leading midstream. And then the third for batteries is really to advance research and production lines for nickel-rich and LFP batteries. This one I'll just say a word about, which is that in the case of batteries, because it is such a complex global market and value chain with really big players dominating it, I don't think it makes sense to try to build lots of homegrown capacity in batteries at this stage. Instead, what we need are innovation and production lines that will allow firms to basically become what Magna and Linamar were for the automotive supply chain, which is, say, really high quality tier 1 suppliers for batteries. That's what I think our target should be. But we still need to actually produce some domestic capacity, that R&D capacity that national firms would provide, but which we don't have because we don't have any large national battery manufacturing machine firms. We basically need to replicate that in the national labs or in some kind of great national project. And that will allow innovative firms coming out of laboratories, both private and public and university, to have a place to actually do the demonstrations that need to be done in order to translate these things into real value. I'm sorry, I don't know why my slides keep going unbidden. The 4th goal is to establish a world-leading closed-loop recycling industry. And because we've already attracted battery factories here, we have a real opportunity to do this in an exciting way, because 10% of those gigawatt hours targets is going to end up as scrap on the floor. So we already are going to start with 10 gigawatts by 2030 if we achieve our targets of 10 gigawatts of recycling capacity needed in 2030, even though there won't be that many vehicles around to recycle. So because we'll be producing batteries here, we can start building a recycling industry, and early action on recycling could really pay off. So there's lots more detail in the report. I invite you to take a look at it, and I'm really excited to share more and to follow up with folks. So the other thing that I do in the report is really try to identify these cross-cutting themes. So if you take into consideration all of the action items in the report, they really can be quite easily boiled down to the argument that what we need to do is create an integrated supply chain. And to do that, we kind of have to work together to co-create an industrial innovation ecosystem, the kind of ecosystem that big national players usually create on their own. But in the absence of that, we kind of have to intentionally do it. Now, you can see this happening in tech in Toronto. It's a great example of a cluster that has been formed around the universities there. And now Apple and Google are coming to Toronto. They're building offices in Toronto because there's world-class talent there in Toronto coming out of that research cluster that was built around a $100 million research institute that was established in Toronto. And there's a great New York Times article on that if you want to take a look at what cluster development looks like. So that's basically what I think we need to do, but we need to do it for mining, and we need to do it for chemical processing, and we need to do it for recycling, and we need to do it for batteries, and they're all kind of quite different. So the report explains concrete steps we can take in order to build this ecosystem, and taken together, all the action items are really saying, do this, build an innovation ecosystem in this really concrete way. But it also has a top-line policy recommendation, which is to use roadmaps in an active way. Canadian public policy programs, subsidies, or what are often called, euphemistically, fiscal incentives, are usually really passive, which is to say that the SIF, which is the Strategic Innovation Fund, or the Net Zero Accelerator, both administered by ISED, they're passive in the sense that they just wait for applications to be submitted. Now, what kinds of firms actually submit applications? Those that have high capacity, and those that are often foreign owned, because they can basically pay the consultants enough, or they have the internal capacity enough to submit an application. So the early starting firms are often, they find it harder to get those applications in. What firms are actually going to put applications in are what they themselves as a firm have decided is the right thing for them. They haven't thought about the whole supply chain. So somebody needs to step up and take an active role, look at the supply chain and say, hey, there's a structural hole there. Let's go fill it. Now, some funds already do this. So Investissement Québec and Propulsion Québec, two organizations with relative independence from the electoral politics of Quebec, they go out and they do this in Quebec. They look at the whole supply chain and they say, where do we want to make investments? Where do we want to secure pieces of the supply chain? Let's go out and do it. So we have examples of this happening in certain places within Canada, but we need it at the federal level, and it has to be active. It can't just continue to be a passive role. Another thing that could be changed on the policy side is shifting funds from late stage, like mature firms that are already commercial, like in the CIF and in the NZA, to earlier stage stuff, demonstrations, public demonstrations. So just to give you an example, Aostra is often mentioned as playing a key role in seeding the oil sands. It was a big public-private partnership. It was actually a crown corporation, but all the major oil companies participated in its experiments and its decision-making to basically get the technological mix right to unlock the oil sands. There was research coming out of the universities that we could use, steam-assisted gravity and other forms of technology in order to get at the bitumen that was in the oil sands, but nobody knew exactly what the technological package was going to look like. Well, we have a similar situation today in direct lithium extraction. We basically know that this is going to work and that it's going to provide a way for Canadian firms to get access to lithium brines. We don't know exactly what technology mix is going to work. We don't know exactly how to solve the problems in the supply chain for those individual firms. And so what we need is some demonstrations, some big public demonstrations. That won't harm the ability of firms to produce IP. There's a little fear of that, I think, but that's partly because we don't have experience doing these big public demonstration projects together. And so more of that, I think, will be really helpful in building the kind of innovation ecosystem that we need. So less funding for already commercial, mature, often foreign-owned firms, less direct subsidies to them, more demonstrations that produce public goods for an innovation ecosystem. That's kind of a key policy recommendation, in addition to producing funds that take an active rather than a passive role in creating the supply chain. So there are priority actions, there are cross-cutting themes, there are policy recommendations, and finally, there are kind of metal strategies. And this is, I think, where the rubber really needs to hit the road with a lot of battery metals, and something that I didn't intend to start. I didn't put this in my initial scope when I proposed doing this project with everybody. But as soon as we started talking to the experts in the workshops, I was like, I have to add metal strategies, because we can't have a sensible conversation about how to build homegrown capacity or an innovation ecosystem without talking about the specific metals. So what we've done is just sketch a couple of them, because each of these metals is inordinately complex, and the targeting for each individual metal and the supply chain and the flow sheet for each individual metal is really complicated. But we need to start building up expertise in this as a civil society, industry, government collaboration, because this is how we're going to win if we do this properly. So let's just start with targeting. Again, I already mentioned that the baseline target is 10%. So that's what you see here. For each metal, I lay out the mandated benchmark. But then in conjunction with the experts that are listed as contributors and authors on the report, I worked out specific scenarios for each individual metal. So working with Lyle Tritton from Tritton Consulting and Giga Metals, we worked out this 35% of the North American market as a doable leader scenario. We're doing a lot more than 10% here under this scenario, and it's based on just accelerated development of existing mines, right? The problem is that there's not too much more nickel after that. So we kind of top out at 175 by 2035 or 2040. And so I think that, that's part of the reason why we need LFP. Unless we want to be really dependent on foreign nickel, we're going to need a higher mix of LFP in our battery mix in order to have higher resilience and more homegrown capacity in our particular supply chain. So that's first. We make individual targets for the metals. The second thing we do for the metal is try to consider what should the flow sheet for that particular metal look like. And here we have just an example strategy flow sheet for nickel that I worked out in collaboration with the partners. And basically what it shows is that MHP right in the middle plays a key role in this particular supply chain, but it might not if the firms were just designing it themselves. So we need to look at the flow sheets for each individual metal, because this is what an integrated supply chain for Canada looks like. It looks like figuring out how we're going to create hub and spoke systems for each of the metals in that strategy, and working them out at a level, how we're getting to CAM, how we're getting to pre-CAM, or whatever it is that we're getting to in order to build the efficient supply chain. So one of these needs to be worked out for each of the metals that is in the strategy, and not even every metal that I'd like to see one done for is in the strategy. Okay, so just to wrap up, and hopefully I've left some time for discussion and Q&A, which is always instructive and really helpful for me. I want to leave you with two key takeaways. First, building out the midstream is the most critical near-term opportunity, which will really allow Canada to capture high value added over the course of the whole transition. It's going to be really necessary to our success, even though it's not as headline grabbing. Nano One's purchase of Johnson Matthey's LFP cathode facility in Quebec, which was only $10 million. So a much smaller deal than the $5 billion Stellantis Windsor battery example. But I would argue that the Nano One announcement could be just as important to long-term Canadian prosperity, because it gives Nano One, a Canadian firm, from Burnaby, but now setting up shop in Quebec, so creating a national firm, really, locating itself in the midstream, right, and giving us the first real North American cathode production facility that's controlled by a North American firm. And so that's, to me, a really exciting development, and focusing on building that out and building out other analogous situations in lithium and graphite and other metals is really the key priority. And the best way to advance the roadmap, to grow an ecosystem, to further refine the roadmap and the strategy that's inherent in the documents that you'll all be getting, is to really focus on increasing coordination. And we argue that we should do that through the creation of a number of task forces, but also that the government should really take leadership here and start to convene industry in the way that the partners here presenting this report together have convened industry, in order to start setting strategy and really think hard about what we as a country can and should be doing today in order to advance things. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt Fortier, who is the president and CEO of the Accelerate Alliance, which is really focused on exactly where I'm leaving that, which is the action and how we're going to create further partnerships to advance this roadmap. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Bentley. That was really terrific, and thanks everybody, and thanks to the other partners on this project. It's really important work, and as Bentley just said, I'm going to speak briefly on kind of what next steps look like, leveraging the great work coming out of this project. So very briefly, for those of you who don't know, the Accelerate Alliance is a sort of a coalition of companies and organizations and other partners that have come together to seize the opportunity that clearly is in front of all of us in the zero emission vehicle space. It's a critical mineral opportunity. It's a battery R&D opportunity. It's an assembly opportunity and a parts opportunity. Frankly, it's an opportunity to ensure that vehicle production continues to be and becomes an even greater part of Canada's gross domestic product and economy, generally speaking. So that's really what our partners and our members believe in doing. So this report and this type of work is critical to getting us to where we need to go. I think, as Bentley was saying, the theme here is defining what success for Canada can look like, and it's focused on a certain segment of the supply chain, a large part of the supply chain, but Accelerate exists to complete that supply chain, as I said, from minerals through manufacturing and recycling, but also inclusive of AI and tech and financial services and all parts of this value chain that can exist for Canada. So one of the things that Bentley referred to at the end of his talk was setting up task forces, and that's really the next step for this. We're working with BMAC and with C2M2A and MAC and other partners, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, collaborating with government to start building these task forces. It's a really important part of pushing this along And it's not just on critical minerals, it's on batteries, it's on manufacturing, it's on investment. But specific to the work that Bentley's just been discussing, we'll be convening these meetings throughout the course of this year to really put together an action plan that is going to sort of see some of what Bentley's been talking about come to fruition, but further refine it, right, to get more industry voices engaged and to bring in the perspectives of government, obviously, but also from the investment sector and others who will have a defining role to play. So, as I said, this is not just about minerals and midstream work. It's all the way downstream to the consumer. But this is an incredibly important part of the work that we're doing as well. I'm looking forward to working with partners on this project and other partners. And to that end, those of you who have not been engaged to date with us, please do drop me a line. Happy to work with all of you on this. This is something that's going to take a lot of heavy lifting from all of us, but it's achievable. It's a big, ambitious project for the country, but if we get it right, it can be an important part of what future generations of Canadians will be doing and will benefit from. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to sort of engage in the conversation going forward. Thanks.
Great.